Hey everybody, what is going on? It is Brian, and today we are doing a blind flight, throwing in the 2021 limited release Maker's Mark FAE-02. Now, I just got this bottle in, and I was doing a live on Instagram, and I asked whether I should go ahead and do a standard review of this, or if I should throw it in with a blind, and the votes came back that I should do a blind. So we are going to blind it with the FAE-01 from earlier this year, as well as I'm grabbing a Weller antique pick that I have. Now, this isn't necessarily one of my favorite antique picks. It's just one that I had open and available. I feel like age range, price, and or relative MSRP and the proof are all going to be really close for these products. So I figured it'd be nice to kind of mix them in together and try something besides just the comparison of FAE-01 and FAE-02. So we're going to jump right in with sample A and get started. Sample A on the nose goes ahead and starts off with this kind of cooked, stewed apple note. It's a little bit sawdusty. It kind of reminds me of like out in my dad's garage where he has his workbench. So it's got a little bit of this, I can't tell if it's a youthfulness, a graininess, but this kind of sawdust, or kind of reminds me of like pencil shavings, and that seems like an adverse note a little bit. And I guess it pretty much is, but there's something that it's kind of sitting in that sawdust kind of pencil shaving realm, mixing in with that fruit, so you get that kind of apple, that strudel note. Still has a little bit of caramel in there, a little bit of butterscotch as well. So let's go ahead and nose down sample B. Sample B is like a chocolate, graham cracker, honey, caramel bundt cake version of the first one. There's subtle notes of apple in there. There's dark fruit notes. There's a little bit of earthiness. There's some barrel char. There's a little bit of licorice note in there. There's like a waffle cone like sweetness to it. Yeah, it's let me go back to A real quick. A is definitely a slight bit brighter in the nose. B is a little bit denser and sweeter, a little bit more confectiony, a little bit more desserty. Let's go ahead and go to sample C. Sample C is the most different of them all. Sample C is like a fresh Honeycrisp apple. It's very juicy, it's very vibrant, it's very crisp. And it has some honey and some vanilla as well. Not to spoil anything, but these are notes that I typically would get from a Buffalo Trace product. Just clean, juicy, apple, honey, vanilla. All right, let's go ahead and start back with A, and we'll taste the palate. A definitely has those toasted apple, slight bit of clove, slight bit of baked bread, baked pie crust note to it. It's got a cooked dark caramel note to it as well. But otherwise, it does have a good bit of like apple-like acidity to it. I'd feel like while it might lay on the tongue a little heavy, it's not very mouth-filling in terms of like hitting the sides of the mouth. It's pretty one-directional. And again, it has some of those fruit notes to it, some of those bready dessert notes, but it does have a little bit of a dry finish. Let's go to sample B. Sample B on the palate. It envelops the palate. It does widen a little bit across the sides of your mouth, sides of your cheeks. It is very weighty on the tongue. There's a deep chewiness to it. There's some fig, there's some date. There's a little bit of the apple as well, but it's more of an earthy, slightly medicinal, and I don't mean that in a medicinal cherry or medicinal grape note. It's sort of the same note that I've mentioned in a lot of older whiskeys that I've talked about here on the channel, like the Old Soul, or specifically maybe the Sam Houston 15. It has this slight bit of herbal meets the slight bit of leathery, tobacco-y, coffee, chocolate, earthy kind of oakiness, just a slight bit medicinal. Yeah, off the top of my head, this seems to be a real similar pour to what I remember the Sam Houston 15 tasting like, or excuse me, the Calumet 15 tasting like. Let's go ahead and go to sample C. Sample C has these waxy cherry notes meet these big juicy apple crisp notes as well. There's a little bit of honey, and it's not very complex. And so there's some of these cinnamon, not quite cinnamon candies, but this kind of warm cinnamon kind of drying that will, again, continue down the tongue. It's a little bit oaky, a little bit cinnamon spiced with some of those fruit notes there too. So again, not overly complex, but does have a lot of clarity to the flavors. Let's go back and run through them one more time. There's something about A, the wallet has this apple and the cinnamon, and it's big and bright. There's something that that does draw out that kind of sawdusty, kind of young, grain-like note too, that I'm just not really agreeing with. Let's go ahead and jump over to B. Yeah, the more B sits, the more kind of chocolate butterscotchy, toffee butterscotchy, toffee chocolate. Those confectioner sweetness grows, but it has a lot of leather and oak. There's not a ton of loud fruit notes to complement some of the other older pours that we've talked about with this flavor pocket. Maybe has bigger strands of vanilla, or they have bigger fruit notes in there as well. Maybe a big berry burst. This doesn't have that. So while it has some low placed dark fruits, it's very comforting. Comforting, chewy, bold, and a little bit spicy pour. And then let's go back to C. Yeah, C is a little bit playful, big, and juicy, and slightly candied. I would say that C is the pour if you want something that is easy, it's not very challenging on the palate. You want something that just is a big fruit bomb, really clean and sweet. That's going to be C. If you want something that has the most depth, something that has the most to sit with, and maybe you like the older, slightly leathery, oakier pours, B is going to be for you. A is the one that I can't exactly pin. A has this interesting balance of fruit notes meets kind of spice, but also kind of meets grain. So if you don't mind kind of that mingling of all of those flavors, if you're one who doesn't mind picking up some of the 4, 5, 6, 7 year whiskey that's out on the market, not saying that this necessarily falls into that, but if you like that sort of profile, you might be more familiar to some of the more grainy pours, then you might like the sweetness and the fruit notes that kind of lay on top in glass A. In terms of the blind, I'm going to go ahead and give it to glass B, followed by glass C, and then going to glass A. If I were to guess on these, I'm probably going to assume that B, the one that I picked first, is the FAE-02 based on the description that I've read. I would say that C is going to be the Weller, and that A is the FAE-01. Let's see, this is glass B. Yep, here we are, FAE-02. Go ahead and go and see what glass C is. Yep, OWA, Old Weller Antique, which is not called Old Weller Antique anymore, just Antique 107. So, and that means that the last place, glass A, is the FAE-01. For the price point that these Maker's Mark LEs are coming in at, They both offer something pretty different, I think, from one another, but yet compared to the 107, you can tell a lot of the characteristics that are similar to one another. I think depending on the type of palette that you go for, I could recommend either one of those. For my palette and liking the older, the oakier, the slightly more tannic, the more leathery profile, a little bit more coffee, maybe a touch more earthy in there, but still has some good sweetness. For me, that is reaching for the FAE-02. I had made comments about it being similar to the Old Soul, the Calumet 15, any of those kind of profiles in that range. But again, we've talked about those before. We've talked about their price point, some getting as low as right around that $100 price point and kind of on up. With this Maker's LE coming in about $60, if that is a pour that you like, if you're okay with the fact that this isn't overly complex, it's not necessarily going to have a bunch of the wow factor. I think for what you get at 109 proof for $60, there's a pretty good wow factor to that. I think that there are definitely worse pours that you could buy. I think there's definitely more money you could waste on other pours. And I think that if that profile that I mentioned in the blind is something that you all like, it's something that is intriguing to me, then I will, I'd have to suggest picking up a bottle of this FAE-02. Now, I will say, for the sake of this blind here, I don't recommend throwing the Weller into a blind with that. And I say that because if you have a pour, let's say of this FAE-02 on its own, then you're going to get a lot more flavor pop out. And there's something about, I don't know if it's the acidity or the proof or what it is about this Weller, but if you put this Weller in a lineup, in a position drinking it before those, for some reason it comes off a little bit more sour, and I think it's going to overall taint the experience that you might have with the bottle. So that's just a disclaimer that I'm going to put on here. I wouldn't necessarily advise doing it in a lineup tasting like that, but if you're looking for something with a full body, some of the oak notes, some of the tannins, this is going to do it for you. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope that might have been helpful to see how these two compare, or how it compares to something else with a similar MSRP made from a different brand. Thanks as always for tuning in. Let me know if you've tried either of these products down below, and let me know if you have a preference of either of the FAE bottlings, or if you're excited about picking up the FAE-02. I'd love to hear what you all think. Feel free to join us on the Entry Proof podcast if you haven't already tuned in. That's a podcast that I do with Drew P. Whiskey. He's also here on YouTube, and we're generally live on his channel on Thursday nights. You want to support the channel, the things that I'm putting out, the content that Drew's putting out here on YouTube, feel free to support us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/entryproofpodcast. Until next time, everybody, we'll see you all later.